normal standard scrutiny meeting, but today it's been converted into a call-in, a unique occasion. This is the first ever call-in that anybody can recollect in Waika. Though the rest of us who are from local authorities are used to call-ins, they're used for many and varied methods and purposes in authorities, and everybody's a different way of doing it. So we'll have to just learn today how this process goes, and we will then meet outside of this meeting to refine it so that we get it correct in the future. So to the officers present, yes, we are intent on probably using the call-in process again when we get it refined. So let's start off the meeting formally. So apologies for absence.
Apologies been received from Councillor Hannah Bithell, with Councillor Jordan Bowden unavailable, Councillor David Merritt with Councillor Jason Rose substituting, Councillor Ralph Berry, Councillor Richard Forster with Councillor Julie Craig substituting, and Councillor Richard Smith with Councillor Mark Thompson substituting. Thank you. And can I formally thank Councillor Thompson for substituting today, and also Councillor Craig and Councillor Rose, and also to welcome Councillor Rose, who I don't think we've ever met before.
Yeah, it's my first meeting. So
welcome to today's meeting. Right, now what I'm going to do is I'll go around and everybody to introduce themselves. So I'm going to get the members of the Scrutiny Board to introduce themselves first. Then I will ask the WICA members who are effectively our guests today to introduce themselves, and then we will introduce the WICA officers so that everybody knows who they are and what everybody's role is. So I'm Councillor Barry Anderson. I come from Leeds City Council, but I am the chair of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority Scrutiny Board. Councillor Thompson?
Yes, I'm Councillor Thompson from Calderdale, one of the two Calderdale representatives.
my name's Councillor Peter Hunt, representing Ellen Ward in Calderdale Council. Thank you.
And I'm Councillor Julie Craig, representing Wakefield Council. I'm deputising for Richard Forster.
Councillor John Lawson from Kirklees.
Jason Rose, Councillor from York.
Councillor Harry McCarthy from Kirklees.
Morning everyone, Councillor Andy Rontry from Kirkstall Ward in Leeds.
Councillor Kate Haig, Farming Wortley Ward, Leeds.
Paul Godwin from Keithley West in the Bradford section.
Councillor Mark Thompson from Kirklees, deputised for Richard Smith, who's on holiday.
It's Councillor Bob Felstead from Bradford Council.
Councillor Matt Edwards, Bradford Council. I'm also Vice Chair.
Good morning everybody, I'm Councillor James Lewis. I am here as a substitute for the Mayor, and I'm leader of Leeds City Council, and therefore a member of the Combined Authority, so one of the members that voted on the paper that's been called in.
Hello, Councillor Peter Carlill. I'm a councillor in Leeds, but I'm here as the deputy for Councillor Susan Hinchcliffe in my role as deputy chair of the Transport Committee, and in that role I have responsibility for bus services across West Yorkshire.
Morning everyone, I'm Ben Steele, Chief Exec of West Yorkshire Combined Authority.
Yeah, morning everyone, Tim Taylor, Director of Transport Services here at the Combined Authority.
And
morning again members and officer colleagues, Satinder Sahota, Assistant Director of Legal and Governance and Monitoring Officer.
Okay, right. Have we got any declarations of disclosable pecuniary interests? None. If anything occurs throughout the meeting, just let us know. Possible exclusions of the press or public. I don't think there's any reason that it should be. The minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of July, are they a true and accurate record for those that were present? Yep. Been approved, right, fine. Right, so the call-in procedure, which is on pages 5 to 8. You've had a chance to read through it. I will take you to paragraph 11. So we are only going to be looking at inquiries specific to the decision under call-in. Occasionally Satinder might elbow me and tell me that's not within the remit, so I'll then intervene and say that's not within the remit. So if somebody starts wandering off, I may have to pull you back again. What we'll do is Councillor Edwards will present on this on behalf of those that called it in, and then Councillor Felsted will then have a chance to add anything further. Then members of the Scrutiny Board will then have a chance to question those two people on anything they want clarified. Then we will invite Councillor Lewis, Councillor Carlisle and the two WICA officers to present why they feel that this was the correct decision, it's been done properly and all governance procedures have been properly followed, etc. That will then be open to us to then question them on anything that's happening. Then I will invite Councillor Lewis and or Councillor Carlisle, doesn't matter which one, to give the final views from WICA's perspective, and then Councillor Edwards will sum up from the people that called it in, and we will then make a decision whether or not to release the decision but with maybe making some further recommendations, or whether we want to go for option 2, which is invite the Combined Authority to look again at the decision to see if they, in the light of what's been said today or lessons that they may have learnt since the decision was made, because when you look at the evidence that's been put in by the Combined Authority today, I think they have just clarified what was meant at the Combined Authority. So as a result of that, we need to make a judgment on it. So that's basically the process that we're going to follow. So hopefully it runs smoothly. So to start then, the decision we'll call him in came from the Combined Authority on the 24th of July, and it was all about the scrutiny process. Right, so if I can just give you some context, if I can get my computer open, as to what it is we're actually looking at today. Right, so this is a call-in of the Combined Authority decision on the 24th of July on travelling to school consultation and policy update. Our job today is we need to ascertain, did the report reach its objectives? Are we satisfied? Was the report, personally, I think we need to try and find out what was behind the report. Was it to make cost savings? Was it the equalisation of services? Was it for efficiency gains? Or was it another step down to bus franchising? It's something that needed to be put in place to enable bus franchising to be a success. We need to ask ourselves, do we understand the next steps and the further consultations that will take place, and who will be consulted, and where will the final policy change go for sign-off? We need to look into the case for change. Was it generally supported? However, most respondents didn't support the option 4, which was the one that was chosen. Most people chose option 1, which was no change, and then after that they chose option 3, which was retaining the existing guidelines with revised funding arrangements. What was the logic? Why it was felt that we needed to overrule the responses that we got. We also need to look into where the number of consultation responses mathematically significant. Was it a good number of responses that they got? Does it give you a good picture, the number of responses that we got? Are we satisfied, or is there any need to do more consultation? Should this report have gone to the Transport Committee to be adopted as their recommended way forward or not, and the reasons why it wasn't? And I can't remember whether everybody else has been given, but I've certainly been given an explanation as to why the Transport Committee didn't take it, so that can come out. Was the consultation extensive enough? Were all relevant partners given the opportunity to contribute, even although they may have chosen not to respond? Are there any wider concerns or policy issues that need to be addressed as well? Does option 4 address the safeguarding mayoral pledge to deliver through a child-first lens. Where are the risks? What are the risks of the new proposals clearly set out? Do we know what they are? And are there mitigation measures to resolve those risks clearly set out? Are you happy that the governance guidelines have been correctly followed in everything that we've done? And are you happy that to release the decision? Now you should have, this to members, you should have an evidence statement from Councillor Don Seary, who is a councillor from Pudsey, who is mainly concerned around provision for Catholic schools. You should have a paper from Councillor Geraldine Carter from Calderdale. Those two you got the Geraldine Carter one early this morning, and then when you arrived in the building today, you'd been given a copy of the Don Seary one. You should already have been sent a copy of the submission by Councillor Debbie Davis from Bradford City Council, Baildon Ward. You should also have received a submission by WICA late yesterday afternoon to explain some of the points raised and why in the call-in request, and also clarifying some of the points and misunderstandings that may or may not have occurred. So has everybody got those documents? Because so we can formally put those on the record that we've now got them. So from that point. So on that basis, Councillor Edwards, can I ask you to briefly set out the case that you've got for calling this in?
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. So, behind the submission that I submitted, because there were 3 submissions, there are 3 broad themes as to why that I made the request. The process, how the decision was made, the wording of the final decision, the actual case for change, as presented in the consultation documents. So, with relation to the process, as it sets out in the document sent from WICA, it was agreed at the Combined Authority meeting on the 3rd of April to initiate the consultation, and it was also agreed for that recommendation to be brought back to the July Combined Authority meeting. The word of that consultation, the wording of the decision made in the April meeting doesn't suggest I think there's room for interpretation that specific proposals to cut services will also be put forward. It just states that the policy will be brought forward. The consultation itself only finished on the 11th of June. That means the Transport Services team will have only had from the 11th of June to the date the paper was published, which I think was the 11th of July, to do all of the work to digest that feedback from the consultation. There were over 3,000 responses, and bring forward a revised policy taking that into account, and then present a statement in terms of how that policy could be implemented in relation to the services. There are quite a lot of bus services across West Yorkshire. That's a lot of work, and that's not giving much room to check and go through the detail and to actually have member input. So just taking one example of the policy, faith schools. There are significant equality concerns linked to faith schools. I know there was some public concern with this, and that some of that particularly came from Bradford. And we've also had a representation from Councillor Seary on this topic. In Bradford, there was a high number of responses about access to faith-based schools, and that's no doubt linked to specific issues in Bradford linked to St Bede's and St Joseph's and the proposal linked to that school made by Bradford Council. The new policy doesn't guarantee dedicated faith transport to faith schools unless it's the nearest suitable school. There is talk about an appeals process, but again, that hasn't really been tested in terms of what that means. There's been no member-led discussion in the public realm in terms of what that means. It's also notable that in Bradford, there were a significant proportion of Christian respondents, and they were notably less supportive of the case for change. The policy, the new policy also states services can move in and out of policy, but there's no clear measure as to what that means, how that will be presented, how the process will work. None of those issues were discussed in the 20 minutes at the Combined Authority meeting where this decision was made. In fact, there was very little discussion on the actual policy at the Combined Authority meeting. It was primarily focused on the implementation aspects. So can we honestly say that this policy that's been brought forward is the best, and have assurance that this is the right way of doing things. In my view, we can't. The next area I want to focus on is the decision-making principles used, specifically the wording of 2.2 in the final decision. Towards the end of the meeting, Mr. Sill summed up the next steps. I'm going to quote you, unfortunately. What's happening with the 6 schools is then an issue of has the policy been correctly applied for these schools and for those 6 services in particular. Great. The problem is that is not what the decision says. The decision, and that's not what the meeting agreed to. It agreed to engage with affected schools to plan for proposed changes. The reading of that is that this is a done deal. In the meeting, Councillor Lamb made perfectly sensible changing to the wording, and he had a very reasoned discussion about the gunning principles. Engage with is a very imprecise term. That was dismissed in the meeting, and the meeting went ahead and adopted the proposals as they were set out. Officers have since, in their submission, said the wording could have been better, and that is actually the whole point of this. This was rushed through without an amendment. This has been rushed. The wording as it stands now looks like the decision has already been made. Some of what has been said in the meeting, this implies that the decision has already been made. In fact, the rationale in the briefing note as to why the whole consultation is happening so quickly is because it has implications for the franchising tender process. Presumably, you need to know what buses to go forward in the tender. That, if that's the case, that implies the decision has already been made. That is all does raise a lot of questions in terms of has this consultation happened, or will the future consultation happen in compliance with the gunning principles? If that's not the case, the combined authority is exposing itself to a legal challenge, and our job as councillors is to make sure public money is being used effectively. The final concern then, the case for change as it's been presented. There are some very valid arguments in the case for change, and I had a good conversation with Tim in my role as Vice Chair and Transport Lead on the case for change. The problem is there's been no real public member-led discussion on this. The only discussion at the Combined Authority meeting was limited to a very specific section of that, specifically the inconsistencies between how the policy is implemented across the different areas. That was quite a limited discussion. There was Councillor Galton's question didn't really get the adequate answer, in my view, and there's still a lot of room for interpretation with that. And that is another reason why I feel that this needs ultimately scrutiny's involvement and actually trying to get some better answers for this. There were other aspects of the case for change that I could highlight that would warrant further questioning. So just to summarise then, in my view, there has been inadequate public scrutiny on this policy. The time window that we've gone through this has been too short. In my view, it's been rushed. The final decision is not robust enough. It does not commit to a proper consultation on the proposed cuts to services. And we also need to know what it looks like, how this policy is going to be implemented going forward. I'm going to park it there and let Bob, I was going to say Councillor Felsted, make his comments.
I'll keep it brief because I think everybody's touched on most of the points I'd like to raise. I'm perhaps in a unique position because I've already seen this change happen locally in my ward, and one of the questions that raised earlier today was no mention of it within the actual consultation papers, which I'm really surprised to see. And from that particular change in transport to Ilkley Grammar, by the way, just in case you're wondering, there was no constructive dialogue with school. In fact, I actually had to go and see the head of the school 3 days before the decision were made to make arrangements for the following year. So that's the first flaw. The second flaw, and I'm presuming that the Transport Committee have looked through the papers and have been provided with all the evidence. 3,772 respondents, but what is the actual size or the head count of parents at the schools? Because we need to give that figure some context. If there's 20,000 parents or 20,000 pupils, conversely, it's a small percentage. If there are 12,000, it's a little more significant. So are we looking at big picture? Are we looking at tiny picture? With the Transport Committee privy to that detail before they considered making the decisions? I then started working right the way through the consultation, and obviously there's a few things that stand out like a sore thumb. So there's a safeguarding issue for kids who might be displaced from a school bus service to whatever they're going to use, and it's twofold. The Mayor has actually promised that she's going to do something to tackle serious violence on the streets with a child first lens. That doesn't appear anywhere in the report. Then the second point stemming from that is the kids that aren't going to be put on a school bus service, how are they going to get to school? And this is a real issue that's not drawn out within the report. I'm in a situation now where 12 months after the implementation of a similar policy in Ilkley and Wharfdale, parents can't get the kids to school on time because bus services don't run at the appropriate time of day. So we've got two choices locally, and it's been raised with the CA for a number of months, and we're looking at it and all sorts. So kids can choose to catch a bus that departs at 7:15 in the morning, gets them into Ilkley at 7:25, and then they have to wait for an hour. There's a safeguarding issue there. If they take the following bus, they get in after school opening time, in which case it's a mark against their attendance record. So a couple of serious concerns there. Do we know where lots of these children live? Is there a bus service? What if there isn't a bus service? How do they get to a bus service? Some people in my ward live 2 kilometres from the closest bus stop, and there isn't a frequent service. Does it come at the right time? No idea. None of this is detailed within the report. Now, I do note that the buses are coming back under public control, and the Mayor's made a commitment to bring them back under public control. But I recall sitting in this very committee when the Mayor actually said to us, bus services that aren't adequately patronised will be withdrawn. Now, the issue here with some of these schools is they're fairly rural. So if there's a bus service that's going to run to begin with, is it going to run afterwards, or is it going to be cut? Which will disadvantage not a great deal of children, but it will certainly disadvantage a few of them. So there's lots of questions coming out of this. The statistics are absolutely fabulous but meaningless because we don't know what the actual size is, we don't know who the reach is, there's no school input here. And if you go and talk to a school, and I did a very lengthy response to the withdrawal school bus services in Ilkley and Wharfdale with the school, and we looked at various things. So walking distances, 700 metres is what the National Planning Policy Framework allows, and that's 10 to 15 minute walk. If you actually overlay a 700 metre rule on a map, you'll find that lots of kids fall outside that area. So what's the impact on the health? They're going to be getting up earlier to catch a bus, to get to school. It's going to extend the day at both ends of the day. So is their performance going to deteriorate because of this? No idea again. And then the flip side of the coin is lots of people used to use the bus service. There are now pupils who used to use the bus service who've been forced to go on the train, and that's caused some issues with SEND and EHCP. So one of the things I'm keen to understand is what's the impact of that versus the cost saving, because obviously it's a lot more expensive to get a kid to school who's got an EHCP or SEND than it is to get a normal kid to school. Currently, what I'm experiencing in Wharfdale and Ilkley is a shift from public transport to private transport, but we live in a wealthy area, lots of people driving to school, which kind of defeats the object of the walking, cycling, wheeling. So lots of questions for you guys. That's why I'm pulling it in.
Right, so before we get to the responses, members of the scrutiny, have you any questions to ask of Councillor Edwards or Councillor Felsted that you'd like them to clarify, or any other points that you would like to make, to ask what their views on those were? Yes, Councillor Thompson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Probably for either really, I was just curious around, you know, when we're referring to the paragraph 2.2 and the meeting of the combined authority where they're talking about members endorse the need to engage in a kind of the adjustment of wording to say undertake further consultation. Now, my interpretation of undertaking further consultation to plan for proposed changes still sounds, and I'm not sure if that's how it sounded to you, but still sort of sounds like it's consultation about planning for something that's going to happen, as opposed to, you know, under the gunning principles when they should be a view that we could change it. And I just wanted to check your interpretation of that wording was that it felt like it was a decision that was going to happen, and that there was no kind of, in that sentence, it doesn't read like the decision could be changed.
I'm not 100% sure I fully understand it. Was the wording of the wording as it's my interpretation of it, and I'm not sure if this answers the question, was that the wording as it stood and as it was passed by the combined authority meeting was very imprecise, and proposal was made. Half proposal was made to tighten the wording to commit to a full consultation on proposed changes, as you would do with changing any bus service. And there is room for doing that, and actually that's, again, as a proposed alternative wording. I mean, I still have comments on the proposed alternative wording, but it was linked to that, and I think from my view as a councillor, papers that we bring and get voted on as members need to be the best that they can. The wording, the decisions need to be. We need to remove the wiggle room for interpretation, because once it protects the decision-making process, and the whole involved point of using members is just to have a precise wording. That's my view.
Thank you, Chair. And I raise this at this moment in time, and I'm conscious it's before points have been raised from the elected member or call-in side, and before officers have spoken as well. But I raise it because I wouldn't want committee members or officers to dwell on this point too much without the aid of clarity. So, the first gunning principle states consultation under the label of formative stage. Consultation must occur when the proposal is still being developed and before a final decision has been made. The decision makers should be open to changing their minds based on the consultation feedback. I'm going to pause there for a moment and just read out that second sentence again for the benefit of officers and members. The decision makers should be open to changing their minds based on the consultation feedback. Having said that, there is further case law, because the gunning principles derive from a 1985 case that was decided in 2011, and this is a Court of Appeal case, and forgive me for sounding incredibly nerdy or boring, but that's part of my role. There was another case involving the London Borough of Brent Council, and that Court of Appeal case states the first gunning principle, by way of reminder, the formative stage, does not preclude consultations taking place on preferred options or a decision in principle, as long as the decision maker's mind remains open to change. So the key, I imagine, if I were to step into your shoes, members, is for you to determine as a committee to what extent officers can satisfy and assure you that their decision-making minds remain open to change. I hope that helps committee members and officers.
Thank you. Right, so I've got Councillor Godwin.
Yes, just a quick question too. Obviously, most people consulted are going to object to anything which increase costs to them individually. So, even though it's a necessity, almost certainly a necessity. The second element is that the school population changes year on year. And while you may have a child that's in a particular circumstance this year, next year they might have left school and that circumstance doesn't exist at all. And I wonder to what extent you feel the decision-making process is at fault, because it doesn't go down to the granular level of considering individual children, which is get a change year on year?
Take that one. Broadly speaking, you're correct. However, having looked at the stats for schools across the whole of West Yorkshire, the figures remain fairly constant. There is a bit of decline in births at the minute in certain areas, but that will be reflected in the current stats because we're already in that reduced birth, deaths, whatever cycle. So it'll have a tiny, insignificant impact.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Satinder, for that clarification. The gunning principle was very useful. Thank you. I think my question sort of is allied to that, is kind of adjacent to that. I'd ask Councillors Felsted and Edwards, thanks very much for your representations. Again, very clear, very concise, and to the point. What I would ask is, in the process, and it is particularly about the process, are we given opportunity to discuss our misgivings about a decision with officers and try and come to a solution or a resolution before call-in? Is that part of the process, and has that taken place at this point?
I mean, my involvement in the process was a very hastily arranged meeting with Tim, which I don't think was ideal for either of us. I was in a service station, he was just got to Keighley getting ready for a consultation event, and that was it was either the day before or the day after the paper's already been produced. I feel with this particular thing, and we're talking about policy, there should be better processes for the combined authority to get member involvement. And again, I think that's the kind of the question, the answer. Were there opportunities? No. The answer was no. There weren't really, because you can't discuss something you're not really aware of until it's about to happen. Could there have been? In my view, yes. And that's what we need to get to the bottom of, because we've discussed in the committee meeting several times about the need to get into a point where we're doing pre-scrutiny. The combined authority as it stands now doesn't seem to like Scrutiny Committee doing pre-scrutiny. That's an opinion, my opinion. And we're now in this situation where if pre-scrutiny had happened on this, we wouldn't be in this situation.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Felsted, you gave quite extensive evidence about existing changes to bus services. So were they under the current policy rather than the proposed policy? And secondly, I'd just like an understanding of sort of to what extent people calling this in believe that we should be supporting parental preference rather than availability of local schools.
Sorry, I didn't catch your first question. Can you just refresh my memory?
It was the evidence you gave relating to the current policy and its effect on.
Right, so in my mind, currently, some of these areas might not be served by buses. So that's current policy. The Mayor has made a commitment to reinstate buses once they're under public control. The caveat to all of that is subject to them being patronised. So if they're not patronised and you've got a student living in an isolated community, how's he going to get to school? So that's the first question. The second question?
It was about subsidy and parental preference.
Right. Schools, I've always believed you're in a catchment area and you are allowed to choose your preferences, and normally that works on straight line distance to your closest school. So your closest school might not be your preferred school. I don't see anything wrong with the current system. If you live in the school's catchment area, you should be a priority in that area. It shouldn't be. If a parent's electing to take their child out of a local school and to a school that's 10 miles away, then that's their decision to make, but they have to live with the consequences, is my opinion.
Can I? Yeah. I have a slightly different. So I think really only the second part applies to me, and that relates to the what weighting we should be giving to parental preference. I mean, ultimately, I don't think the role of scrutiny is to go into that kind of like policy level decision. My view is making sure that the policy that's brought forward is the best that it is, as per the mayor who is the elected person in this. I think there's room for us to disagree and not disagree with policy. That's politics. But our role in this capacity of scrutiny isn't to be bringing that to here. It's making sure that the policy, as it's written, there aren't issues with it that could lead it up for interpretation and problems later down the line. And that's kind of where my objection is focused on.
So is your contention there's a conflict between the Mayor's stated policy and what this policy will introduce?
No, my view is that the policy is the policy is a big piece of work, and it's been done quite quickly. It needs to make sure that there aren't. We've all seen it where policies where the wording of thing is imprecise and it leads to interpretation, and that's ultimately our job as scrutiny. It's not glamorous.
So this decision that has been subject to call-in by members of this committee is in relation to a combined authority policy, not a mayor's policy or the mayor's policy.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Councillor Haig's question and Councillor Edwards' response has helped me a bit over something I was going to ask. Can I just make sure I understand clearly what you're seeking here, Councillor Edwards? Is it ultimately a better implementation of the policy? How do you envisage the mechanism of the call-in as going to help that? An instruction to think again, if you like. What's your, as a sunny day scenario for perfect outcome following a thinking again? What would you like to happen? Thank you.
I think to some extent we need to see what happens in this meeting before I really formulate that. I think it's already worth saying that we've been talking about this policy for nearly an hour, which is 3 times more than the only public discussion of that, and that was a driver behind us doing this, was to make sure that as members who represent the public can have confidence that councillors are actually just basically representing their views and representing their best interests, which is what we have achieved today. To some extent, what I was looking to achieve has been done. We're here talking about a very important policy. As in terms of what the recommendations look like, we'll have to let the combined authority representatives here to respond, and then we can take that from there.
Could you add to that? Sure. Right, so for me, this is about process and protocol. So the call-in is about revisiting the data, talking to school and getting some lessons learned from school that's already gone through this process. None of it is in here. And I think we're making a decision without understanding the pitfalls.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentations. You're well-founded and well-presented, and the information you've given us has actually added to the bulk that we've got here today. I want to go back in terms of the consultation process, if I may, because I think I can see here from the consultation process, and I had already identified it in the formative stage that you brought to our attention here today. And basically the wording of it is something that I believe is the basis of any decision-making policy. I wonder, and I've looked through the papers, and I've looked at the percentage of respondents. what are your views and are you satisfied with the format of the consultation that's taken place? Secondly, within the numbers that are within the report, and I haven't seen it and do forgive me if it's there, what was the indicative percentage of expectation of respondents? Because normally consultations and surveys do put out a basic expectation of replies. And when I look at page 30 of the table 1 of survey respondents, in total, as mentioned, it was 3,722. Now, I imagine that's got to be put aside, the normal and the amount, again, as Bob has mentioned, of the places where the consultation took place. I haven't seen here, do forgive me again, normally in consultation process, and conducted through major organisations as well, we have an identity of where the consultations took place. Were they places where people, parents, could get to be informed of it? And again, typical of what we expect these days in terms of people being able to reply, it's all about reply to a survey. Have you a view in terms of where the consultation would have been better in terms of informing the parents and those who are guardians of children for taking to school, that would have enabled more discussion to take place? And lastly, in terms of the changes that are proposed, and again, within the document, we're speaking about buses, and you both mentioned children with difficult conditions, shall we say, such as SEND, etc. Was there any consideration taken in your view, of where that need is in demand, may be affected, and has the consultation or any information that you've got, which seems to be very quick and sudden, looked at any other transport arrangements, i.e. local contracts, minibuses, etc., to help those kind of children? Thank you, Chair.
They are excellent questions. I would say that would be, I think the fact that those questions exist demonstrates why this needs more member involvement. I'm not saying that that hasn't happened and those questions haven't asked, but they've not happened and been asked in the public realm. And I think that's again why we need to use this as an example as to why the process, as to why how policy is being formulated isn't, in my view, working at the moment. Because those questions, if we'd not been here today, those questions wouldn't have been asked by a councillor before that policy was implemented. And they're good questions. In fact, I don't think it's really fair for me. I don't want to go into the level of that detail because, again, I think that's the questions that really we should have had the opportunity to talk to officers about. And that's the whole point of this. So thank you for just illustrating some of the questions that councillors should be asking on this.
Yeah, I think it should have come to us all in the first instance, to be honest with you, Betty, so that we've got a chance to feed it out to communities to actually get the number of respondents up. I mean, stats are great when you're presented with them like this. I'll give you a great example of a stat I've been working on for some time. So in the State of the Region report produced by these guys, it said GVA in West Yorkshire went up by 13.6% compared to the UK's 11. Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? The key bit of information missing is what is the value of GVA per region. You actually find out it's 23.7 less than the rest of the UK. So one figure paints a picture and another figure paints a different picture. And I think at the heart of this, and I'll come back to it, it is about respondents, it is about getting it into schools at the first stage, that they've got an opportunity to communicate this to parents. And I think that is a fundamental issue. The first place we should go to with engagement is the affected school, hospital, whatever it is, so they can disseminate that information to the cohort of people who actually use the facilities, so it gives maximum exposure to what's going on. putting it out online and saying, oh, this is going on, that, I mean, I don't know how they've advertised this, but I look at CA polls quite frequently because I'm included in the emails, and I look at the number of respondents and I think, is that statistically significant? And that's why I come back to this figure of 3,722 people, of how many is the fundamental thing for me, because I've worked in, not marketing, I've worked in software, but marketing's part of what I used to do. And you can be presented with figures and you can make some horrible decisions based on a really tiny percentage. So for me, it's kind of flawed at the first stage, and that echoes precisely what I went through with Ilkley Grammar. They knew nothing about it, so...
Councillor Godwin, go to the officers.
Yes, I just want to be slightly devil's advocate on that remark from Bob. The trouble with the consultation process is that most people aren't interested. Most people don't participate, even if it affects them. I think that's our general experience of consultations. Secondly, this is very much limited to the people who have children who might avail themselves of a bus, which is itself limited again. And thirdly, this is dominated by support for Christianity. So you're limiting it again to people who are Christians and who may wish to send their children to these schools and use public buses in this way, because obviously Asian people are underrepresented who probably don't but may well use Christian schools, and it's again people who may need to send their children out of the area and don't avail themselves of the religious schools in the area, such is the case in Keighley, for example. So you've got a very selected minority in the first place, and I don't think you can criticise the fact that it's underrepresented. The second thing is I don't think it's the responsibility of the Scrutiny Committee to take that opportunity, which is what you seem to imply. That's the job of the councils who are represented in the West Yorkshire Combined Authority to sort that out. And this has been, I would have said, given maximum publicity in Bradford. Everybody's aware about the changes in the buses because it's been in the news forever, due to maybe a clumsy decision-making process in Bradford. So I think it's unfair to complain about consultations when it's extremely difficult to get consultation responses anyway, but that's just a point I'd like to make.
Thank you, Chair. I'll make a start, and thank you, everybody, for the presentation and questions so far. I know school transport is a really powerful issue for a lot of people. I think my first bit of councillor casework when I was elected in 2003 was a school transport issue, so I know the impact it has. Nobody knows anything about where my ward is, but it is a rural area. It does have a lot of school transport issues, and there's a lot of issues here that I've engaged with over the years. And I think as well, in that, recognising that school transport is a complex picture, in that some, as the Council for Ilkley has highlighted, some services are provided under the framework of the Combined Authority, some are provided by schools themselves, some are provided with funding from local authorities, often to, as we've talked about, the number of children in an area. It's often when there's been a particularly high number of children in an area. So it is a complex picture, and one that we do a lot of work on. And also another thing as well is a big advocate for public transport. I think if children and young people have a good experience of their bus to school, it may make people more likely to catch buses in later life. If people have a poor experience, then again it might cloud people's view of public transport. And I think so far there's been pretty much a consensus that we do want public transport to be better and better used in West Yorkshire. So turning to the, I think I will, so we're not all repeating ourselves on the top table and to get through the meeting. I think there's a few points I'd like to make, particularly around the combined authority decision making. And like I said when I briefly introduced myself earlier, I was I'm a member of the combined authority, and I've checked I was at both the meetings at the initial call for consultation in April April the 3rd, and then the meeting, the decision has been called in on July the 24th. I think there's a couple of things I think is really important around the process. And I'll take it that the whole committee's read not just the papers for this meeting, but the April the 3rd paper, which is a relatively short paper, and then the July the 24th paper. And I do think it's important on the clarity of timescale that when we, as a combined authority, started out on this process, there's a number of things. First of all, we recognised the policy hadn't been updated since 2019. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes in the world since 2019. It was important that the policy was reviewed. Clearly, we go into that when we review a policy, we are always aware that an outcome is it could change. We don't review a policy knowing it's not going to change, and that was recognised when we went into it. In terms of some of the more detailed questions about timescales, again, it is when we took that decision to consult on the policy on April the 3rd this year, we were taking that decision mindful that the paper committed to changes that could come from reviewing that policy could start in September 2026. So we were fully mindful in that process that it was, it was setting in process a sequence of events that would come back with a revised policy, and any recommendations for changing that policy could be implemented from September 2026. So I don't think there's any question that the timetable of how changes would be brought forward was unclear moving through that policy. And again, clearly, there was always, right from the start, there was a possibility there would be changes, because when you revise a policy, you don't go into it thinking, oh, well, our revision is going to be agreeing it's right all along, and the case for change was set out. And then I think that brings us forward to the July 24th paper, which wasn't a decision around individual services. There are some services in there that it recommends are looked at, and I'm sure Tim in particular, or maybe Councillor Carlisle, will pick that up. But I do think the process has been clear in terms of right from instigating the review of the policy, recognising that changes could come in from September 2026. That sequence has been very clear. And in the minds of combined authority members, right from the very start. And I think that, again, people looking at the process will have understood that timescale there. So I don't think there's been, as has been suggested, it has been a process that has not been clear around the timescales, as we've already discussed, so I won't cover it again. We've gone into it with a view that the consultation was important on the policy, but determining the policy is different from looking about how that applies to different individual services. And the decision we took on July the 24th was revising the policy with some consequential decisions, with some consequential services that will be looked at again in light of that policy. But the fact that those services were there was clearly indicated right at the start, because it did recognise some of the changes could come in September 2026. And I'll leave my comments there, Chair.
Thank you. I'll come in, if you don't mind, Chair, with a few more, and then I think others will pick up the specific points. I'll echo Councillor Lewis's point. We've been very clear through this that school transport is a very emotive topic. So I was very aware, and I know there'll be a number of concerns around how the policy's gone. There were a number of concerns around the consultation. I received many from my own community, as well as those wider from other councillors around the city and from residents around the city. Just a little bit around why I think we started. Well, there's one thing I think I do want us to remember through this. Many, and in fact the majority of children, do walk, cycle or use public transport to get to school. We're looking at those that have a specific school bus provided by the combined authority here. Not every child has that. And the main reason for bringing forward the review of the policy is that inconsistency across West Yorkshire. That's come from a range of things, inheriting services from different local authority policies that they had originally, a different geography of local authorities, services brought in when national guidance was at a different position than it is now. It's left us with services that aren't a consistent picture across West Yorkshire. That is clearly recognised, I think, by most members and by people in the consultation. The policy review, therefore, was to ensure that consistent and equitable approach across West Yorkshire, which is something that I think we want to go forward into franchising with, a consistent and equitable bus service for everywhere, including then the public transport service. And through the consultation, there was clear support for the objectives that we laid out that we'd like to see around school buses in West Yorkshire. I will just point to Councillor Felstead's point. We did contact all elected members in West Yorkshire around the consultation, as well as every single school was contacted that currently has a school bus, I should qualify, and all the school bus pass holders, so all of those that are provided with a school bus pass were contacted as well. So I think what is a benefit here is, unlike a very public consultation, we do have a quite engaged set of people that we have the contact details of. I can think of many West Yorkshire-wide or Leeds City-wide consultations that have been appropriate for everyone, where we've had fewer than 3,700 respondents. So I'm, in fact, very happy with the level of response we've had over this. There were a number of options that were close in terms of when you look at the preferred options people had chosen of the 4 we put out. However, then when you looked at the feedback, as I did very delicately in looking through the recommendation that was given to the CA, it was clear that the separate comments that people had provided gave more clarity to why they had put a particular option through, and were able to be used to separate those out a little bit. Hence, the recommendation to the CA was there to ensure we had a policy at West Yorkshire that was fit for purpose. We absolutely recognise the need to consult with schools where a specific arrangement may not continue in the same way it has previously. And I think that clarification in the report provides a view of where I always knew we were. Any school service that will change will be consulted with that school. We review school services every year anyway, as part of the standard policy that's been in place for a long time, and they are reviewed consistently. But every school will be contacted in terms of that. And just to clarify, the policy that the CA made a decision to go forward guarantees that every child will have an option to get to their nearest suitable school, either by walking, cycling, public transport, or by a dedicated school bus as an option. If they can use those 3 methods first, we would prefer them to walk, cycle, or use public transport rather than a dedicated school bus provided, as many other young people across West Yorkshire already do, and find it easy to in many ways. I will just make, just as a final comment, one separate point. This doesn't affect local authorities' requirements to provide free transport to a number of young people, many of whom have provided a bus pass on the public transport network. That isn't part of this decision. This is around which school buses the CA provide. And it doesn't affect local authorities' policies around send transport. That is a separate policy that local authorities have. Sometimes the combined authority may, in fact, contract that on their behalf or manage that on behalf of a local authority, but they are requirements local authorities make. They're not, I don't think, for the discussion today here. Okay?
Thank you, Chair. Just a few more points from me to build on some of the points that have previously been made. I think if we start, just to re-emphasise the point that what we're doing here is reviewing and considering through the policy decision that went to the CA what has been a very long and evolving change of policy in terms of the configuration of school buses over time and how they've evolved over time. And to some extent, those then were inherited by the combined authority as a result of changes in constitution and arrangements. Absolutely appropriate to do that in light of both the changes subsequent from COVID, changes in travel habits, but also in terms of a preparatory need to make sure that we were consistent going into bus franchising, to make sure that we've got a set of arrangements which are consistent from a policy, both from a school point of view and from a general public transport point of view as well. So it is really important that we give ourselves the time to do that. In my briefing notes, again, just to re-emphasise another point, in the original 2.2 recommendation, again, I would question it is often difficult to differentiate between consultation and engagement, but for a point of clarification and to recognise the fact that there may have been a misinterpretation of that, it is for me important to make clear that what we absolutely are doing through the paper that went in July is seeking requests to implement a new policy, and in doing so the paper then highlighted schools which are by the application of that policy out of policy and therefore subject to further consultation to ensure that the application of the policy has been taken and interpreted correctly. The briefing paper also sets out in section 7 a really detailed timeline, which again I hope gives committee members comfort that there is a detailed and very well considered process that we would then follow to make sure that that schools have the opportunity to ensure that the application of the policy has been properly interpreted. So, for example, if our expectation is that there is a safe walking route, and in fact there is not a safe walking route, then obviously we will reconsider the application of that policy on a case-by-case basis. As Councillor Carlill has made clear, throughout this process we've done really detailed engagements with schools ahead of both the consultation starting, as a consequence of the consultation completing, and ahead of the paper publication that took place in July as well. So all of those things, have both been done, but will continue throughout this process. So there is, no shortage of good quality engagement and consultation taking place with schools across the board. I will stop there, Chair, and perhaps welcome some comments.
Promotion, Barry.
Ben.
I'll just make a very few comments, Chair, because the comments that I would have made have been ticked off my list by the contributions of others. I think the first thing I would say is that we have had a very internal and robust process within the organisation, specifically to address many of the issues that have been flagged by members of the Scrutiny Committee. As you would expect, we do challenge the processes that we put ourselves through to make sure that they are fair and equitable. Second thing is that, as Councillor Lewis has said, the core purpose here was to create a policy framework that was holistic, that did think about the needs of school children in the round across West Yorkshire on a fair and equitable basis, and it's important, I think, not to lose sight of that objective. The third point I was going to make is on consultation. Tim has outlined the specifics there, but the point I would make is that we typically run consultations that are by necessity a survey, because you want to ask everybody the same questions and make that accessible to all. But we then follow that up with a process of more in-depth targeted engagement. Now, I think the use of the term engagement is what has caused the challenge, an issue of clarification here. We tend to see engagement as that kind of next level of engaging with people to help them complete the questions in the survey, so that we've got that in-depth knowledge from particularly from affected groups, and that was done in this case too. The next thing I'd say is that in terms of the relationship between Transport Committee and the Combined Authority, in terms of what decisions are taken where, it is important, I think, to remember that the subcommittees are just that. The Combined Authority is the decision-making body. It determines what it delegates down to other committees and what views it takes into account. And as the paper set out, both in April and then in July, all local authority members were approached, but on this occasion the Combined Authority took the decision, which of an issue of this magnitude, I think is right and proper that the Combined Authority felt that was not something that could be delegated. But members were involved, and the presence here of Councillor Carlill demonstrates that. And the final point I'd make is the issue of, was this rushed through, the issue of pace. The core timeline, as Tim has set out, was worked out many months before, because this process went through a long process of calibration. The key thing was to ensure that decisions weren't taken at a point in the annual cycle that would leave parents making choices for systems that are then changed, or schools inadequate time to prepare parents for what was coming. So the July decision was giving enough time for any schools to be engaged with before any changes that would not, as the paper was clearly set out, would not come into effect before 2026, before the start of the school year in September 2026. So this process has been carefully thought through to minimise any short-term impacts of any policies. And finally, of course, as others have said, and it's really important to hold in mind, the July decision was about the adoption of a policy, not about the agreement to any impact on any individual school. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone would like to start asking questions of our four guests? Yes, Councillor Rhodes.
Thank you all for adding value to this morning's debate as we're having it. First of all, Tim, and it's been mentioned a few times, can you determine what a safe route is encapsulating? What information do you use to call it a safe route? Because obviously, unfortunately, I'll say, these days, lots of parents are very, very concerned about what happens en route to schools. I think that's the first one. The second one is, and I'll come back to you if I may, Peter. The second one was a comment that you made that every school who had this service was actually contacted. The school was contacted. Can you tell me what that contact was? How was it instructed and delivered to the parents who were actually involved in the need of said service, which is very important in terms of redistribution of the faith, so to speak? And lastly, I think that I felt a little bit aggrieved that we had to get a lesson in what was the difference between consultation and engagement. I think those of us around the table involved in scrutiny are well aware of the difference of it. But the difference may not have been that open to people out there in understanding the importance of what a consultation in terms of any priorities is and are and could be for the future. So I'll leave it at that for the moment, if I may.
Tim, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just start picking up on the safe walking route. So the safe walking route has to include footways and footpaths, which don't require children to walk on main roads or side roads without any provision to them. Safe crossing points need to be included as well, and safe step-offs across that route. Due regard should also be given to things like canals and rivers and ditches, and also the speed of traffic and field of vision for pedestrians and motorists as well. So there's quite wide-ranging guidance which specifies the precise definition, and again, we can happily share that with members should they need to see the precise wording of that. But there is legislation which sets out very precisely what that looks like. And again, you know, to my earlier point, Chair, if we've misinterpreted what we believe, because clearly not every child will take the same route to walk to school, they all start from a different point of origin, as you might well expect, making sure that those are, you know, are well considered and we have taken due regard as to what we consider to be safe. The whole point of engaging and consulting with the schools.
Do you want to do the letters to the schools, because it came from you?
Do you want to, okay, yes. Councillor Rhodes, if you want to come back on that particular point.
I'm sorry, could you just clarify the question? As in when they were last updated for what?
Or in general rules on safety, and I'm thinking about police, etc., etc. Because we asked the question when we have our PACT meetings, for instance. Can you tell me the last time any of these safer routes were actually investigated or updated in terms of their safety?
They're done on a case-by-case basis, but they're only done when it is a decision that we consider that might be a safe walking route. So what we don't do is routinely go out and survey every safe walking route for every child, for every school bus, because clearly that would be an impossibility.
Well, I appreciate a bit of demanding, but I think it's a question worth asking in terms of parents. And lastly, is over to you, Jim.
I'll just add to that one if I can briefly as well, because I interrogated some of this. So as my role as deputy chair, then I've briefings with Tim very regularly, and I think what I wanted to do is make sure I was interrogating the recommendation before it went to the CA in that way, really. I did a couple of things in order to do that. One is I asked a number of questions about routes in my area so I would understand them. There's a route I would not consider safe, and when I questioned it, the reason we provide a school bus in that area is because that route, which there is a footpath all the way, but it's along a 40-mile-per-hour road, I, as a parent of an 11-year-old, wouldn't allow my child to walk that, and was given the reassurance that we wouldn't deem that as safe, and hence we provide a school bus for those residents in that area. There's other routes I would feel were safe, and yeah, absolutely, the CA felt that. That will be covered in the consultation when any decision is taken to consult with the school over their arrangement. So if we believe a walking route is an alternative, then that whole route will be reviewed, but then there will be a consultation of whether parents feel that route is safe or not. And I'm sure we'll have some really interesting discussions and debates about whether that is safe. There may be routes which we say, actually, that's not safe yet, but maybe it would be if we were able to do some more work as a CA using some of our work we do around schools. But let's see how that goes as and when individual routes might be looked at. In terms of the communication to the schools, there was a letter to the head teachers of schools that have dedicated bus services provided by the CA. I'm sure in the majority of cases, and there where most of the feedback I got came from, that was then shared with parents or put in the school newsletters, etc. We can't guarantee that every school did that, but we did also then write to all school bus pass holders. So the majority of individuals on these bus routes who get their school bus pass would have then received that information directly. It was shared around, I think, especially those schools where they were most concerned, which were a lot of faith schools, I think, where they were aware they weren't necessarily the nearest school somebody was. They'd made a choice to go to a school some distance away. In terms of that, and as I say, I mean, I was very happy with 3,700 responses. I think is a very good amount of responses, and leading through, there was a lot of detail in that to read through. The consultation versus engagement, I think there's a bit of an aside on this, and some of that's the wording of the report. What I understood would happen, and I think what CA members understood would happen, is if there was ever a suggestion that a route wouldn't continue as a dedicated school bus, that there would be a consultation with the school, and we would take into account any comments people had around whether the alternative was safe, or whether there were specific needs for that dedicated school bus before making any decision on that service. And the same will happen with the 6 schools that have been identified to start that process, ready for September 26. I think that answered all your questions, Councillor Roach, but do remind me if...
Councillor Lewis is going to come in.
Thank you. So, Councillor Rose didn't direct a question at me, but I do... there was a really useful point there, Betty, around hopefully not to spend all day arguing about the meaning of the words consultation and engagement. I think one thing, and you've referenced your scrutiny work in Wakefield, I think one of the things, you know, there's councillors from 6 councils sat round in this meeting today. I think one of the things that reading the materials and hearing what members have said already, being absolutely crystal clear about what a consultation is from changes around it, is something that regardless of the outcome of this meeting, I do think it is something that we at the Combined Authority are really clear around when we say consultation, what that means. And I do think in terms of, I mean, clearly the calling today is on the specific paper around the policy, but in terms of being clear around it, as Councillor Carlisle has said around individual services, being really clear what consultation means, I think is something, like I say, it's something we are really rigorous about. We are really rigorous about in Leeds, about what consultation is, when it starts, what's been consulted on, when it stops, how the outcome is dealt with. And I think that is something, certainly listening to what people have said today, is something that we need to be really clear about the combined authority as well. Like I say, there's probably there's 6 councils sat around the table plus a combined authority, so that's 7 different organisations, probably 7 slight variants on that, but I do think, like I say, it's been really, really clear from the combined authority. When we say consultation, this is how it works. It's something that in this landmark first call-in is something I think has come out of this meeting for me around that. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you. Right, I've got Councillor Rowntree, then Councillor Thompson, then Councillor Haig.
Thank you, Chair. I don't share Councillor Rowe's irritation about the definition of the time it's put into defining consultation versus engagement. I think it's, although I think it's worth spelling that out. I think from where we are now, we're sort of looking to go to the affected schools for some detailed and probably difficult discussions in a lot of instances. And I'm just sort of thinking, in the course of these discussions and what comes out of it, and how what we're left with afterwards, may not mean that sort of the closures in the term of services in the terms that we're thinking of at the moment. And what does that mean for the financial envelope? Because I'm just thinking, I don't know if finance is a driver behind this. I don't think it is behind the policy choice, but finance always matters. If you're not cutting the services, does that mean there will have to be cuts elsewhere? How's that going to be handled? Thank you.
Who wants to take that one?
I can take that one from a political side, and then the finance wasn't the reason to start this in the first place, really, because the reason to start it is because when you look over it, and I've had a list of all services provided some time ago with all the details, you can very clearly see that there's inconsistent provision across West Yorkshire. You see that then in the responses to the consultation, which feeds in that, I mean, Wakefield have next to no services provided by the combined authority. They in fact have private school buses provided by Arriva. That's something that we're looking to, obviously, because we'll take those on under franchising, but it's very different. Had I looked at it and reviewed the feedback and it been very different, I would have had no hesitation in recommending that we triple the amount of services and giving that as a problem to Ben with his budget to try and find. But that wasn't where the recommendation came to, really, when looking at the options. But no, if we end up and 6 services here are looked at and it works out that 2 of those, after consultation, we don't agree have a safe alternative, then I don't think we're in any concern about not providing that there. We've identified that we'll look at those 6 to see whether alternatives are provided, and if there is a safe alternative, we'll remove that. We then come to the franchising process, which gives us an opportunity to change bus services if we wish to. So if there isn't an alternative, we could then look at the bus network over a number of years and decide maybe there's alternatives we could change in order to provide an alternative for people, but that's something we'll have to do, obviously, over time.
And Chair, just briefly to add from me, you'll see from the paper that came forward, actually, even if we were to implement the 6 schools that have been proposed, actually the budget savings there are really quite modest, in the order of about £200,000 per year relative to a £90 million budget. So, you know, I would support Councillor Carlo. You know, this was not born from a process of budget saving. This is born from a process of a means to allow us to get to a more consistent and equitable service and its application across the districts.
Thank you. Right, I've got Councillor Thompson, Councillor Haig and Councillor Lawson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd say that kind of that response that we've just got now is probably more clear than what's been out publicly in terms of the future consultation with schools. Because I was conscious, and it's partly why I asked the earlier question, and there was a comment from the chair of the Transport Committee that was talking about we will engage with stakeholders and the parents and carers of the small number of children affected. So I think if you're a parent reading that, you think I will be affected, and also it will be engagement, not consultation. But helpfully, it sounds like that, you know, if you go to a school and Councillor Mrs. Carter will probably shoot me if I don't mention the C6 bus, but obviously if you go to Across the Heath and look at that bus, and it's determined there's not a safe alternative route, obviously the option is there to say we will continue providing that route, which is a lot clearer than I think we've had in the past. I know we're not specifically, it's nothing to do with the kind of EHCP and that policy and those individual policies in terms of local government, but there may be on these services, if they are pulled, and also in the wider context of this policy, an impact on children with EHCPs. Now, it's not that individual policy, but you could end up in a situation, say, where in an EHCP, for example, this specific school is listed as the setting and the bus were pulled and there would be an impact in terms of potentially that child may need to get homeschool transport. I know it's not about that policy, but was that kind of impact considered in this? Because there may be a knock-on in this policy in effect for SEND children and those on SEND support as well. So I just wondered if it was considered, even though we're not looking at that policy.
I think it was considered because, again, I think there are inevitably examples of where EHCP children do use general network services or indeed these dedicated school buses and don't have the need to recourse to specific standalone SEND transport arrangements. But again, the purposes of both the equality impact assessment that we undertook for this decision and the subsequent consultation that we're saying takes place is to actually allow us to identify where those instances exist. And again, we've already had some correspondence on a school in Bradford to that exact end from both a parent and a ward councillor. So, we are aware of that, and that will absolutely be built into that consultation that will take place.
Councillor Haig, then Councillor Lawson.
Yeah, thank you. You've just mentioned the equality impact assessment, but it's alleged in the call-in notices that was not provided or considered as part of this decision. Could you clarify that, please?
Well, it was included in the papers, and it was part of the decision-making process that was afforded to members to take the decision. So I'd argue that it was made available and was part of that decision-making process.
Mr. Lawson.
Thank you, Chair. We've heard today about providing a consistent and equitable service throughout the borough, which is a good aim. Nobody's going to deny that. When we talk about services being withdrawn, though, are we talking about a consistent and equitable alternative? And I think that was raised in the beginning representations. Road safety is mentioned once in the report that we've got in front of us, but it seems to be a really big concern in the open questions that have come through the current consultation. Now, that asks the question: should we have a baked-in question about road safety and alternatives, and not just about road safety, but infrastructure, about what's happening in your area? There just seems to be a little bit of if we're going to look at these alternative routes of walking and infrastructure after we've made decisions, it just seems as though that perhaps we should be doing some of that reporting beforehand, and that information should be available to people before they then go and start thinking about their own alternatives for their child's travel to school.
I can come in on that. I think really it's focusing on part of the implementation of this policy and how that will go forward. I think the policy says there must be a consistent alternative. Yeah, there must be walking, cycling, or a public transport alternative to this. There will be many views from parents at a school in whether that alternative is suitable or not, and that's something we're going to have to review as we go through. I think I'll be plain to you, when we've done it a number of times, I'm sure we'll be able to much clearer give you what that feedback is. At the moment, we're only just starting to engage with those schools. There is a policy around the safety of that, and we will have 12 months to suggest to people now what alternative route we think may be possible for their young people, and then a consideration to let them know in time in September what decision we'll be making. So there will be a period of that. I think where I was talking about infrastructure and improvements, let's say we looked at one of these now and were of the view that a walking route wasn't suitable. Then we could maybe think, well, maybe in 2-3 years' time a walking route would be suitable. Let's move that to a later stage in the process. In the same way, we could look and say there's no public transport option here. Well, we may look at it now and say, well, when we're controlling the network, is there an opportunity here to do something different with the public transport network so that these young people can get to school? I am confident through looking at it that when people have been considering the road safety and a safe route to school, the public transport network, whether it is safe, whether there is an alternative, whether there is enough space on the bus is something else that's been considered, that when we are suggesting there's an alternative route for this, a really good review has been done on that. We will then get feedback from parents of what they think about that and from young people themselves and from the school. And that will be the time, I think, where we'll be able to see what's there. But there was clear support for the objectives in this policy that I think are what we will be driven by, that people do believe young people should be walking, cycling or using public transport to get to school where that is available. I am sure we will have debate about whether people think that's suitable or not. But that's for, I guess, the next stage of this and for us to see maybe when the next decision comes forward, how that's come about in these different instances.
Yes.
I'm grateful for that answer that you've just given as well to John. I'm a bit concerned that the issue seems to be we will do this after. Has none of this been done now in terms of the routes? I've had a reply saying, well, it's too general a thing really, but has none of that been taken into account now when you're looking at a safe route? Because you've mentioned the methodology of getting there. So is this an afterthought, or is there information now on those routes? I'm not asking you to go over all Bradford, Kirklees, Caldwell, etc. The routes you know now, has there been any update and any information looked on it in relative to the plan and the proposal? Because if you're saying now, you might be able to look at this, and you said, Tim, you said, look at this 6 later on. Now, if I've misread or misheard, please tell me, because I don't want to have the tail wagging the dog, or whether the dog should be wagging the tail here. Clarity, please, Tim.
Yeah, I can clarify, and Tim, if you want to come in. Yeah. There are suggested alternatives to the routes to the school buses that are here. What we haven't done is engage to find out whether people agree that they are alternatives. So we have suggested alternatives for these 6, otherwise we wouldn't have named 6 schools as possible to go in. Yeah. They have been checked for a number of things. Maybe Tim can go into detail exactly what they are. What they haven't been done is tested on the ground with parents. And that's, I think, why I'm being cautious of those, because as a parent of a child that goes to secondary school this year myself,
yes,
it would be up to me to decide whether I thought that route was safe for my child to walk. Yeah. So,
can you just
CA officers have come up with an alternative.
Forgive me, Peter,
no,
Chair.
Absolutely, yeah.
There are just some niggles that need to be identified. What were the people that you just mentioned? Who were the people you just mentioned in terms of these routes?
In terms of who've identified the routes or who'll be walking?
Yeah, you've just said that there was a discussion with other people. Who were the other people?
Not sure if I mentioned the word people, but that might be me not remembering exactly what I've worded. But in terms of it, officers at the CA have identified possible alternatives to these bus routes that are there.
Yeah, that's the one we need further information on, I think, which would be very helpful, Chair, if you don't mind.
But a decision hasn't necessarily been taken on these 6 routes, so I'd come back slightly maybe to the decision there. Okay. It is then for a consultation to begin on these 6 routes to see whether that alternative is true or not. What I don't want to do is prejudge whether that alternative is deemed appropriate for the parents of that school and the young people that go to it, I guess, is why I'm being very careful in my approach. And yeah, as a parent myself, I wouldn't like the combined authority necessarily telling me it was safe for my child to walk to school or not at that time.
Appreciated. Chair, the last bit of that, Tim, which I think should knit it all together, is what you've just told us today, part of a written policy statement in the implementation plan?
Well, anyway, if Tim is going to come in and then Mr. Still is wanting to
just very briefly, just to add to Peter's point. So not only have we assessed whether we think there is a reasonable alternative, either be that public transport or through a safe walking route. Because the vast majority of pupils that use these services are registered users, we know where they live, and we've looked at individual places of residence relative to the school and plotted what we think would be the most feasible and intuitive walking route, or their walking route to the nearest bus stop to catch an alternative bus or public transport option as well. So that has already been done on a case-by-case basis.
Tim, can I just interject? Do forgive me, Chair, we're not getting the clarity here. I've heard that, and I appreciate that. But my point is this. You've got down here on the chronology that you've worked through, and on the 24th of July, it actually mentions the proposed policy and the implementation plan. That's good. The second part of my question is, you've just identified that there may be a situation where the routes that you've looked at now may have to come for further consideration. Is that part of a written implementation plan?
Yeah, it's included in the briefing notes.
The wording I've just said is it is imposed in the implementation plan.
So the implementation plan for the next phase of the process is the detailed table set out in section 7, I believe it is.
I appreciate that, I've seen it. My question still needs to be answered. Is the information we've been given today about the safe travel that we just want to get clarified, is the future in terms of that plan here, implementation, does that actually mention there that if any of the routes that are identified within these schools affected are not classified as safe enough, that then they will be revisited and reviewed?
Yeah, so there's a stage in there which is described as evaluate results and make recommendations, and what you're describing is contained within that task.
Okay, we just needed to be sure it was written in. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Philip.
Okay,
Peter.
Thank you, Chair. I think that Tim has picked up the point I was going to make, really, which is just this clarification again, that the discussion here is about the policy and the adoption of the policy by the Combined Authority in July. No decisions, I could be a bit bolder than Councillor Carter, no decisions have been taken on the implementation of that policy on any specific school. Those will come forward to a future Combined Authority for decision.
Thank you. Right, I've got Councillor Edwards, then Councillor Felsted, then Councillor Rose.
I'm going to ask a question a bit, I suppose, almost as if I was a different person making this call, and it's more of a just general scrutiny question. So, in the report 4.37, the line that it says that, so it relates to the implementation. In September 2026, a total of 6 school services have been identified for withdrawal. I have a couple of questions on that. One, and that actually immediately feeds into what Ben's just said, should the word potential have been included in there rather than identified for withdrawal? It's potential withdrawal. That way the public can have confidence that it's a genuine consultation process. 2, what did that process look like? I think that was the kind of the crux of what Councillor Rhodes was saying. And I think there is work potentially for scrutiny to do some greater and more in-depth work on that particular aspect of things. And then 3, were these the only schools that didn't meet the criteria? It said 6 have been identified, and that's what you're moving forward with. But were any other schools identified or as being potentially borderline or meeting criteria, but there were other reasons why they're not being considered? Yeah.
Should I take that one?
So I accept that the wording on 4.37 probably could have been clear in terms of potential or possible inclusion. So I think that's a fair point. But to that point, the previous paragraph does make clear that there is the need to still do that engagement and consultation with their schools ahead of that change taking place. So I think it's the context of the wider conversation as opposed to the specifics in the paragraph per se. In terms of the application of the policy, there are other schools that don't immediately meet the policy as set out. The reasons for those not being brought forward at the moment is because they are much more complicated and there's much more complex arrangements in place for those schools. And to Councillor Carlill's point as well, the opportunity that franchising allows us is to make sure that actually if there are alternatives in place, we have the ability to make those changes ahead of any changes being proposed. So it's a configuration of the network as much as whether or not they meet the immediate policy of itself. I think it's really important to make the point that just because a school doesn't necessarily meet the policy doesn't mean that we have a statutory requirement to remove it at the earliest opportunity. The whole point of this process is to bring forward our views on those schools on a case-by-case basis relative to the revised policy and make sure that we've understood their application and interpretation correctly.
Councillor Felsted? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Just specifically that last point and suggesting that there's wiggle room. My understanding is the whole point of this was to make sure the policy was being implemented consistently, but you're saying that there's now wiggle room, and that could be done on a case-by-case basis, and that kind of is a bit contradictory. Sorry, Tim.
Well, what I was attempting to articulate was that the application of the policy is a process that you wouldn't do over in one single exercise because of its scale and complexity, but also application of the policy over time changes on the nature of the way that the network is configured. And again, with the near-term opportunity that franchising allows, what we want to make sure is that we use that as an opportunity to make sure that schools services are given that opportunity to put in place reasonable alternatives.
Just a clarifying question then, sorry. So if some schools have identified and we're saying that franchising potentially could be a solution, then presumably the combined authority won't be making decisions about that until franchising is complete. And which, I mean, I appreciate medium term, but certainly some parts of West Yorkshire aren't going to be happening for a good, what year are we in? 3-4 years. And even then there'll be a lot going on. So, I mean, point was made in the meeting that franchising gives us an opportunity. These changes are going to be implemented before franchising happens. So I think we need to be really careful about that, saying that.
I'll be a bit clearer on it, really, from that. The schools identified have alternatives. So the schools that are listed here have alternatives already, either walking, cycling or public transport routes. There are some that may not fit the policy that don't have alternatives. If franchising allows us that alternative, decisions on those haven't been taken. And I guess whether the monitoring officer wants me to answer that question or not, is a different point. But at a point, we'll come to decisions around those services. I would much rather, and I think everyone would much rather, we'd make those decisions at the point we've had a chance to influence that network. So there will be a first round of franchising. We could look at some school services after that in order to allow us to provide alternatives to areas where we're currently providing a school bus at the moment. We will then continue doing that over a number of years, and the implementation plan suggests this will be a number of years. So just to clarify, and I'll counter your point slightly, franchising will be over before this implementation is suggested as being completed. So franchising will be in place everywhere before this implementation is suggested as being completed if it goes ahead of the timeline. However, decisions haven't been made on those further steps, and they'll come to the CA at the appropriate time.
Just one final question. I think we started.
Sorry, I think
Thank you, Chair. Just three quick points to build on what my colleagues have said. Firstly, I think we are hearing loud and clear the importance of safe routes, and we'll definitely bring that out in subsequent reports to the CA about individual schools. Secondly, I would expect, and we will make sure that there is a full EQIA for any of the assessments of individual routes, as you would expect, but I'm just providing it for clarity, just so there's no... and the EQA that Tim has been talking about was for the policy, not for the application in individual schools. And then finally, given that Councillor Carlo has talked about his child going to secondary, I ought to declare that I've also got a child in secondary school in West Yorkshire, and in fact at Ilkley Grammar School, so I'm just declaring that conflict, even though I don't think it's directly relevant to the discussion this morning. Thank you.
Councillor Felsted.
Yeah, just one final question. This is in relation to what we've said today. We've said there's an imbalance or disproportionate representation of school transport within the various authorities that make up West Yorkshire. I'm just wondering how that is affected by population and geography, which I presume are two factors which factor into this report that we're not privy to. And I'm just trying to understand the mechanics of how you've identified the schools. And I know you've dragged out one of the points, which is substitute public transport. But to what extent is there an imbalance across the region based on population stroke geography?
I'll start. So I don't think it's population and geography. I think it's more history of how. I think it's history of how with different councils, different areas. We've touched on it earlier around, for example, Arriva in their area they operate in, particularly Wakefield. They have in the past just put on a network of school buses that they have delivered directly, whereas in other parts of the county it's been the local authorities and the combined authority that have organised those services. So I think it is there's probably a combination of factors, and I mean we're 10 past 12, having given this a going over, so probably giving a very long history lesson isn't going to be welcomed by anybody. But I do think that's why, given as Peter has said a lot, so I'll try not to repeat it in detail. We are going to have a completely different way of organising buses in West Yorkshire that we are going to bring in over the next 4 years. And I think, therefore, having a really clear new schools policy with that in mind around how, with the opportunity that hasn't been had in this county since the early 1980s for the public authority to determine what bus services are, to have a really clear approach to school transport as part of that, is to be welcomed. And that, like I say, that's why I think a bit of the history lesson is irrelevant, partly because it's probably not very interesting to anybody else in the room apart from Councillor Carlisle, but also because, like I say, the reasons we've got here will disappear when we have a franchised public bus network, and we do have that control and process of setting a bus network. So I think it is an important, and I don't think it's because people in Wakefield are different to people in Leeds. I represent a ward on the border. We do cross the boundary quite freely and intermingle quite freely. Like I say, I think it has been around different bits of history in an environment where buses have been operated in a fairly free-form fashion over time. And like I say, that bit of history is going to disappear soon. That's why I do think it's relevant. We do have this policy in place for franchising, and as has been touched on earlier, the process of setting some of that work is going to start in a few months' time.
Do you want to say something, Peter?
I'll just very briefly provide one bit of more detail. Having looked at the entire list of the school buses in every district and how they're provided across West Yorkshire, I can say categorically they are completely inconsistent with the population and geography of West Yorkshire and how you'd expect. Some of the most rural areas have the fewest. Some of the most urban areas have the most. They're based on completely different decisions made by councils over the last 20, 30, 40 years, rather than on the geography necessitating that level of service. And that's where the inconsistency stood out mostly to me. Those areas where you can imagine somebody would need more transport to get to school are not necessarily, and are not consistently, where the biggest set of bus services are provided.
And may I
Mr. Still
just add to that, and that's why the adoption by the combined authority of the policy that ensures that the provision is calculated on a fair and equitable basis and a consistent basis across all the schools in West Yorkshire is absolutely the purpose of it, to bring consistency and fairness across West Yorkshire.
Okay. Councillor Rose, then Councillor Haig.
Thank you. If you'll indulge me, I'll set out where I am from a call-in perspective and my big remaining question. I've understood all the papers and conversations today. I don't think the briefing note adds much, as the existing papers explain the detail of the decision. And actually, I think a lot of today hasn't been call-in, so I welcome the suggestion from the Chair of a lessons learned meeting afterwards on the process. On specifics, 4.37 says the substantive practical changes come into effect only from September 2026. 4.32 says the only changes before that already existed in policy. 4.30 recognises the mandate for some faith school free transport and send provision, though as stated that has its limitations. Women, Christians and white people do skew the overall consultation results, but 4.17 breaks down some of the detail for other groups. And as you've discussed, there are inherent existing inequalities this might improve. I generally agree with the policy's travel hierarchy. Risks of the policy include grammar school equality, faith school for non-faith reasons, lower income households, children with complex needs, in addition to geographic challenges around getting to school on time, long waits during bus changes. 4.15, 5.1, 5.2 acknowledges equalities negatives and the equality impact assessments. 4.40 explains the care needed for that. 4.36 explains the staggered implementation. 4.39 says changes beyond these 6 need further detailed assessments. Option 4 wasn't the number 1 result, but it did have majority support. 4.46, 4.47 explains why it was the right one to make the decision, and the policy took months. So I feel it was made with understanding and thought and is made appropriately. But I think there are improvements that could be made, and I do think it should have been discussed at Transport Committee, even though it's a combined authority decision. Regardless of the outcome today, I think there needs to be a proper conversation at Transport Committee about this to help move forwards correctly. But going to Transport Committee in the first place would have avoided this. I'm still undecided right now on option 1, option 2 today for one reason, because I'm not sure why an organisation with the concept of transport pre-scrutiny wouldn't take a travel policy through it. So I would welcome a bit of light shed on that specific aspect if that's possible.
Who wants to clarify that point?
So I think from a when you say pre-scrutiny, do you mean scrutiny of this committee or Transport Committee? Sorry, just to clarify.
Transport was what I meant, but in general.
So it is largely a question of timing in terms of the sequencing of the events that took place. And again, in the briefing note, it does set out what the process that we've been through. I accept that whilst it hasn't gone as a standing item to Transport Committee of itself, there has been very detailed engagement, consultation and dialogue with Transport Committee chairs and deputy chairs throughout the entirety of that process, starting at the start of this year. But it was done from a timing perspective very much to allow us to get to a point where a decision was taken ahead of, as I stated earlier, going to the CA in July to allow us to then start to form our views ahead of the franchising process commencing in October of this year. I accept that had the time allowed it, then we absolutely should have taken it to Transport Committee where the timing allows, but at the moment the timing was not permitted, in large part because Transport Committee was the day before the CA as well, on the 23rd of July. But I'll stop there, Chair.
Okay, Councillor Rose, do you want to come back in again?
Yeah, just very briefly. I appreciate the timing post-consultation and pre-authority decision was quite tight, but there were several months during the consultation and many months before that where the content of this could have been brought to Transport Committee, right? And it wasn't, because you were waiting for results that you knew wouldn't then have time to discuss before the authority meeting. Is that fair?
I think that's. I accept the point that it could have. We could have taken longer to do the process that you described, but this was a formative policy. I inherited this policy, or what was the change in this policy when I joined the CA in the last year, recognising that we needed to do the work, and it took a number of months to get to a point ahead of going to the CA in April to allow us to even have something to take to consultation. But I accept that, again, were the time permitting, then we would have been in a position to do that, as you described.
Okay, I've got councillors, get it in the right order. Mr Still and then Councillor Lewis have indicated they would like to come in.
I think Councillor Lewis should come in first. I'll come in after him.
Okay, I just want to make one very quick point. So we have Combined Authority Transport Committee, which is a subcommittee of that, and the scrutiny meeting, which we're all sat at today. Just a very quick point about our Combined Authority. So It used to be the case we were the only combined authority in the country that had political balance members on it to ensure it was never dominated by one political party. I don't know, with the increase in combined authorities, whether that is still the case. But I just think it's very quickly worth reflecting that the combined authority is a cross-party meeting. And although it is clearly not a scrutiny committee or the transport committee, it does allow challenge from political parties, not other political parties than the one that the mayor and currently all the leaders are members of as well. So I do think that's just a point around the combined authority. It is not a it is not a rubber stamp.
Thank you. I'll just build on that if I may. I mean, I think Councillor Rhodes makes a completely fair point about asking the question, why was Transport Committee not engaged, and should it have been, and should we have done that? And Tim's outlined the reasons, both why not, and the fact that engagement was made with the leadership of Transport Committee, as well as with every member across West Yorkshire. I think for us, though, the question is a fair one, and it plays into a bigger question that we are grappling with at the moment, which is with the advent of the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill, what is both the appropriate committee structure that the combined authority needs going forwards, and how do we best action that over the coming year? So it's the point's really well made, and we'll play that into future thinking as well. Thank you.
Councillor Rose.
Let me narrow my point, because I was going to ask why there wasn't a need for an extraordinary meeting, but actually my question is, given that 12.1 of the papers say that there was a 3rd of April decision to proceed, and then there was a 16th of April Transport Committee, why was it not brought to that Transport Committee? That feels like it was within the consultation period, knowing that there wasn't time for the report, if that makes sense.
Councillor Carlisle.
Thank you. I'll come in briefly. On the following Transport Committee after the 3rd of April, I'm pretty sure we did have a paper in that updated members that decision had been taken. The CA, coming from a local authority, the CA is always a bit of a conundrum in terms of where certain decisions are made. Certain decisions about transport projects go to the combined authority meeting rather than Transport Committee, because they may be over a certain value, or they may be deemed a budgetary question, in which case the budget is set by the CA, not the Transport Committee. So there are a number of points where these inconsistencies happen, and I'm not 100% sure that, as an organisation, the CA has got it right yet in exactly what comes where at the right time. But we're on the way, I think, to that. It's a lot different than a local authority, which has had a whole history of reasons for why particular decisions come to certain meetings and particular decisions are gifted to meetings. The CA is on a process there, and we're very close to being a mayoral one. So I think, I find it quite...
A tiny final comment is just, I agree the decision should be made at the combined authority level. I don't think it should have been a decision at Transport, but it should have been a discussion, and I can't see in the papers that it was a discussion. I mean, I wasn't there, somebody else might have been, but that's what feels like a disconnect for me, is that there was the opportunity to know that the consultation results couldn't be discussed, but at least the consultation contents could have been, and it would have resulted in an opportunity for that to be discussed publicly. But, as I say, I think the decision was made properly. It just feels like that one bit should have happened and didn't.
Right, Councillor Haig.
Yes, and just picking up from that, and sort of the other side of that coin, it was suggested that this should have come to scrutiny in some form before the decision was made. And in fact, in the papers in front of us today, there's a press statement proposed that says that scrutiny committees have got an important role to play in ensuring the combined authority delivers the very best outcomes for our region as part of our democratic checks and balances. And this call is an opportunity to answer any further questions, but could have been avoided, I think, if that had been taken up in advance of the decision rather than afterwards.
Yeah, no, valid point. Okay, right, I think we've...
I would like an answer.
All right, okay, fine. Tim, Mr. Still, anybody want to explain why, you've said it in your statement, why you didn't do it in advance? You've conceded, but...
So, I think we do recognise the role of the Scrutiny Committee, but in doing so, in general terms, and I think this was perhaps mentioned at the very start, not every decision necessitates pre-scrutiny in terms of the way that I think it's perhaps been described. So I think, we'll reflect on on that view of members, but equally, you know, we have to recognise that from a decision-making point of view, that isn't a you know, statutory requirement.
Yeah, it might be worthwhile. Yeah.
Yeah, I think going forward, I think building into the timetable the possibility that Scrutiny would like to do some pre-decision is really important, because having the excuse of we didn't have time when things are taking months does not seem to sit well with that when we, as someone pointed out earlier, meet every month.
Yeah. From my personal point of view, you do have regular meetings with Councillor Edwards, who is my deputy, and he takes these decisions. If you say to him in your briefings that you've got this decision coming down the line, and if he then says to me, I think we should, as Scrutiny, have a look at it, I think that satisfies my test that I've asked someone to do it. So that's maybe something we need to just implement. Councillor Thompson?
Yeah, just on that, I mean, this is sort of my second meeting of this committee, but this seems to have been already expressed. I know you saying that not all decisions need pre-decision scrutiny, but it seems like the consensus is there's not really ever any pre-decision scrutiny. Just in terms of what we're discussing in terms of Transport Committee, I've just got the terms of reference up, and I appreciate this is sort of beyond the calling, but within that, obviously expresses that any direction by the Mayor that a decision goes to Combined Authority as opposed to Transport Committee, and there's obviously exceptions within, and I wonder if just across the committees, when we're moving forward and looking at how those committees function, just more clarity on that would be helpful, so it's really clear to members what does and what doesn't go to Transport Committee, which may have helped avoid some of this. Thank you.
Still?
I think both the point about pre-scrutiny and almost the question of the balance of how that gets suggested by who and when, and the point about Transport Committee are really well made, and we'll look at take both those things away.
Carlo?
Yeah, thank you. Just for the benefit of members, really, and you'll know these discussions anyway, Barry, but Councillor Edwards and I have had some good conversations around how we improve scrutiny and how Transport Committee are better sharing their forward plan and work plan with yourselves and with Khalid's support there, to make sure you are aware of what reports we may be looking at when, so that if you wish, you can suggest an item that you'd like to see more of in a particular date. You know, you'll know we're looking at the local transport plan in October, and you may say then, oh, would that be something interesting to bring to the September meeting then? So there's a bit more of that, and I think that's something that's taken us a while to get round and get understanding, but hopefully that'll allow for more of this in the future. I know we're going off topic slightly.
Councillor Rhodes, and then I will bring an end to it.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment, if I may. I think there are issues that it's not down to us as scrutiny to look at those decisions, but it's always handy to know what is happening, to make that definitive choice ourselves, as is the role and function and the right of scrutiny. And particularly when you've got sensitive issues such as transport to school. There are a lot of people dependent on it, particularly with vulnerable children as well. But forgive me, I'm going to bring in the monitoring officer as well as Ben. It says under the appeals process something that I've left till last because well, they used to say in Yorkshire here, gobsmacked, and I'll apply that. Item 9 on the appeals process, it says a suitable appeals process is currently being developed. Does that mean that we don't have an appeals process in place at the moment? Or does it mean a suitable one because it's something to do with a definitive item such as transport? I find that really, I can't get my head around why this combined authority at present, it seems to indicate, and it doesn't confirm either way, a suitable appeals process is currently being developed.
Can I clarify? That appeals process is specific to these school buses. So the decision was made at the CA to undertake this new policy, and then a specific appeals process will need to be developed if somebody does not agree with one of the implementations of one of these school buses. So an appeals process will be created for if we go into schools and consult on a particular service, which we start doing in September, and then somebody does not agree with the outcome of that, that they can appeal that decision. We are several months off any of those decisions being made, so it is now the right time for that appeals process. We wouldn't have needed to create the appeals process ahead of the decision, and I'm sure had we created that appeals process and done a lot of work, that would have seemed like predetermination in many ways. But we now need an appeals process for this policy.
But there
and
again,
that's
that
part of
comes down
officers'
to
work.
how the wording is coming forward in documents. And that is a general view here. That should be specifically identified, that this is a process that's specific to this particular topic stroke item. Because otherwise, that's just a generic comment, and I'm sorry. But please, can we have that amended somewhere in your reports? That is the reason why that's there. Thank you, Chair.
I'm now going to invite one of the four of you, don't know which one, to basically conclude, bring the conclusions and drawing together what you've learned, what you're going to change as a result of this conversation today.
I think I might start us off if that's okay, and there may be some points that Ben might want to come in with that are wider points, I think, than my role around the place of scrutiny, what decision should go where, because that isn't a decision for me to take. Hopefully what you've seen is we've set out clearly how we consulted on what completely agree is a very emotive decision, and we knew that there would be a lot of debate about it. We have looked in detail at the feedback and the consultation, which I think was well responded to, and a recommendation was put to the CA that I believe to be the correct one, and I could have at any point suggested a different recommendation to the CA through that had the consultation come out differently, but I agree with the recommendation that was put to the CA based on the feedback that was given in that report. I will focus again that we are looking at those who get a dedicated school bus. Many children already walk, cycle or get public transport to school, and the consultation showed quite clearly that the majority of people agreed with the objectives that people should walk, cycle or get public transport to school where they're able to, and dedicated buses should be provided as that final solution. And also that the policy does guarantee that every young person will have a school bus or will have transport available to them to their nearest school, whether that's walking, cycling, the public transport or a school bus. So I think there were a number of guarantees in there that would be provided. The implementation is over a long period of time. We would have been very concerned starting a new policy and then looking at the whole host of school buses at a time. We have identified some that we believe alternatives are there for to take the opportunity to go forward. But I really do think there was a need for a consistent approach to school buses across West Yorkshire and to get away from where we are, which is a myriad of approaches that have come forward from a period of time before we were a mayoral combined authority. There are a lot of learnings, I think, here around scrutiny at the combined authority and how it can be best done. And those of us who've been here a few years and some have been longer here have seen that has progressed, and scrutiny has changed every single year. I think I've been at the CA, as well as Transport Committee changed slightly every year I've been at the CA as well. So it is a progression we're under, and I think that's why I'd like Ben really to comment on some of those bits. But I welcome the scrutiny and the discussion of it. I'm quite happy with the decision that's been taken personally, and I think it was the best decision and reflected on the feedback that came out of the consultation. Thank you.
Ben, are you wanting to clarify? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So what I'll try and do very briefly is just relate my conclusions to the 5 questions that were set out to us from the committee. So in terms of the first one is around the details of the consultation, which I think we've obviously discussed in depth. I think the action on us, therefore, is much more about the application of the policy to individual schools, and we've discussed the need for having a clear appeals process, having the proper EQIA, having proper regard to safety, all the things that you would absolutely expect us to do, and we've been clear that those decisions will come back to members for those decisions to be taken in public. The second topic that you raised was around the governance pathway and why it didn't go to Transport Committee first. We've obviously discussed that at some length, and Tim has set out the rationale on this particular occasion. But I think what we've committed to is that we do need to look at that in terms of the decision-making processes going forwards. As Councillor Carlisle has said, sometimes it is complicated. Combined authorities are in a very rapidly evolving environment. The devolution and community empowerment bill gives us now, for the first time, a kind of clearer framework through which combined authorities can operate, and we'll be bringing propositions for how to bring that to improve things, given that increased remit going forwards. The third point raised by the committee was around political accountability, and I think we've had clear conversation there. I think that's where the issue, not just of political decision making, but also of the role of pre-scrutiny comes in, and we definitely need to give further regard to that. Fourth issue was around the purpose for the change in policy. I think we have, in several responses, been tried to be very clear as to the rationale for the policy and why those changes were being brought in, and Councillor Carlisle has covered those issues really clearly. And fifthly, in the decision-making principles and around concerns around predetermination, I think both Councillor Lewis and Councillor Carlisle have been very clear that they felt they had the full range of decisions and options set out before them, and there was no predetermination. So I think that covers, and the only other point I just want to make in my closing remarks is we've talked a lot about terminology, and Councillor Lewis has been, I think, very clear about the distinction between consultation and engagement. We will take the lessons away in terms of the language that we use in reports going forwards to make sure there is no confusion in future reports. Thank you.
Very much. Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to use a transport metaphor to illustrate my point. So my issue wasn't the starting point. My issue wasn't the decision to move or the final destination. It's the journey. Government needs to get, and that's all levels of government, including the combined authority, need to get it right, how we do things. Our role as councillors on the scrutiny and the Transport Committee is to make sure that the journey was done right. That's our role in this. What I wanted out of this, I think I was asked that earlier by Councillor Rowntree, it was to have some greater public scrutiny, and I think we've done a lot of that today. So thank you, colleagues, for being part of that. To illustrate the point then about getting things right, so Councillor Lewis stated in his comments at the very, very beginning that the process has been quite clear from the start, referring to the decision at the April meeting. The wording on 2.2 recommendation, again 2.2 is the recommendation with the issue. I'll just read it quickly, and just to demonstrate the point I'm making. That members note that the responses and recommendations of that consultation will be brought back to the Combined Authority in July 2025 for consideration alongside any requests for approval for proposed revisions to the transport policy to allow any changes to be incorporated into future service design decisions. I really can't see how that makes it clear that a list of proposals to close, to potentially change bus services and withdraw them, I don't feel that is clear. Imprecise wording leaves room for interpretation. You can quite easily interpret that as that, but I could quite easily at the time have interpreted it slightly differently. We need to get wording spot on, and I think if we need to learn anything from what's happening in other countries, the US for example, if we have imprecise wording, we're relying on good faith of the people in charge now, the decision makers as they are now. We don't know what things are going to be like in the future, and we do need to really get this right now. So the crux of my issue is process, and again, Councillor Lewis, I'm going to pick on you again, sorry. Having watched the Combined Authority meeting, it was 20 minutes long, the section on school buses, and I'm not sure really how that was a robust discussion on this policy. I'm not going to go into that too much detail. Councillor Carlisle has talked about his involvement, and I know he will have been involved, and I know how robust he would have been in his challenge, and I can imagine how in-depth that conversation was. but publicly he wasn't. There's nothing on public record to document your involvement, and that actually has been changed in this meeting, and you've actually been able to, the points that you've made have all been really valid, and you've added a lot to this. You are effectively operating as a portfolio holder for buses, but in my view, and I know how the Combined Authority works, the Combined Authority has a lot of meetings, they're behind closed doors, they're not on public record, and that is something we need to change, because we need the public to have confidence that us as councillors, whatever political persuasion we are looking out for the public interest, and at the moment that's lacking. So a few of the comments, the Combined Authority that were made, that there was a need to update the policy. I absolutely agree with that. That's not the point of what I've been trying to make. Again, it's been focusing on what's happened. And I mean, in terms of documenting how important doing this is, again, Councillor Collins actually demonstrated it in a really, really good way why this is important. So there have been several comments made about the consultation not being good enough. No discussion of that at the Combined Authority meeting. There's been no public challenge by councillors on that. That criticism has been levied. Specifically the point that councillors and schools weren't told. You challenged that and said actually they were. If that had been done in a normal scrutiny meeting, we could have had a more in-depth conversation on that and looked, or if it had been happening at Transport Committee, we could have had a more in-depth discussion and actually talked about what good enough was. At the moment, we're talking about whether it actually happened. There was a comment made on the timetable and why it was important to do this quickly. Ultimately, the fact that you didn't do it properly has slowed the process down anyway. We are here, and that has slowed the whole process down by a few weeks. And process is really important. So just revisiting the points I made in terms of my rationale, there wasn't adequate public scrutiny on the policy. To some extent, we've fixed some of that today. Do I think it's still good enough? Not really. There's still some detail that I think there is room for discussion on. The time window was too short and it's been rushed. No one really has said anything that challenges that. I still feel it's been rushed. The decision wasn't robust enough and it didn't commit to the proper consultation. It's been argued that Combined Authority members understood what was being meant. In my view, that's not good enough. Imprecise wording, we need to get the wording right on recommendations because they give room for misinterpretation. And we don't know how the policy is going to be implemented going forward. We've had, again, some discussion on that, but I think there's still room for further examination. That might be something that either Transport Committee or Scrutiny can look at in the future. I think there needs to be a discussion in terms of the committee members in terms of the next steps, but that's my stance on things as it stands now.
Thank you. Right, now, before we reach our final decision, I'm going to have a 5-minute adjournment. One, to enable people to reflect so that they know precisely what they're wanting to do, either releasing the decision for implementation or releasing it and making some recommendations which will be a separate part, or going for the other option which is to refer it back. So it's to give people a chance that if they're wanting to go for release it, but maybe with some provisions being added onto it, that gives you a chance to formulate those in your mind. Because what I'll do when we've come back again is I'll firmly ask people, are we going to have option 1 or option 2? But those of you who might be tending towards option 1 but have got some procedural concerns, it's how you're going to word those procedural concerns, which will be dealt with after we've made that decision. So in other words, it will be a clear-cut option 1 or option 2 that we can then append other recommendations on to the end of our recommendations from today. So just so that you're clear that that's what we're going to be doing. So it's now 12:45, 12:50 if you can get back in here again. Yes, Councillor Haig.
Just for clarity, if we choose option 1, does that take into account the changes that were made in the document we have in front of us, so the changing of engage to undertake further, all those that are on this paper here?
Do you want to clarify exactly what that, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. So from my perspective, and I think this engages your point, sorry, I use the word engage, forgive me. It's really important that the minutes of this, from my perspective, incredibly helpful and constructive discussion between members and officers, are referred to the combined authority, irrespective of which decision you take, option 1 or option 2. I think it's going to be super helpful that the combined authority is aware of the discussion by way of these minutes once they're produced to be appended to the next agenda item. So, does that help?
My particular point is the changes that have already been suggested that are on the paper in front of us here. The changes about the wording, this talking about the detailed timetable and consultation timeline. Is that included now in what was effectively the original decision, option 1, or do we need to add that in?
The way I was going to deal with it was put that as the recommendations, that we've heard officers have conceded that certain things need to change, and so that's one of our additional recommendations. What that benefits us from scrutiny, because we can then ask for consideration and we hear in 6 months' time, have you actually done it, for example, and that gives us some steps. So that's the way I was going to do it, was a straight yes or no on option 1 and option 2, and then come up with a set of recommendations. Because my feeling, I might be wrong, but the way we were going, I can see us going in one direction, but I want to enable us to reflect back on recommendations that we would like to put in. You might prove me wrong, of course. I've been wrong before when it comes to voting records. So
I think the point that
yes, right. Do you want to just clarify that then?
So just to expand on the point and your helpful point, Councillor, as I understand it, your concern is, does this committee accept or otherwise the additional information provided to it today? So I think it would be helpful, again for the minutes, for the committee to come to that conclusion. So if you like, that's the first bit, if that helps you.
Okay, right. So it's now 48 minutes, so let's make it about... We are, right. Okay, right. So we're now going to decide on option 1 and option 2. And what I would say is, if we're going for option 1 and you're wanting to go for option 1A, which is adding some recommendations on, we'll discuss that afterwards, but it's a straightforward option 1 or option 2. Now, to save going through for a roll call, which is the way that we usually do it in Leeds, we'll just go for a straight show of hands. So those in favour of option 1 indicate, please.
I want to see what the option 1 is.
Option 1 is to release the decision for implementation. Right. That's 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7. And those who are going for option 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 for me. So is that right? Okay. Right. So the option 1. So the decision has been released for implementation. So in terms of option 1A, as I called it, that's where we've got some recommendations we'd like to make as per item 4V11 31V11. Any wider conclusions? What we're going to do is we've been picking up notes of them as we've been going through. But if anybody's got any additional ones that they would like to be submitted, because some people have got to go now, so I'm using Chair's prerogative to say, if you can write in to me with your views and your thoughts as to what you'd like to have as additional recommendations, we will then get those formally approved, either by using some legal means, or necessarily we'll have to postpone it until the actual next time we meet to officially add those codicils on. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. I've noted your point about people wanting to get off very quickly. I've just had a quick consultation with Ben here, and I think it's important that this meeting is the outcome, even though the outcome is to release, the follow-up comments, which I think have been really important and we've all acknowledged, come to a future combined authority meeting. So we'll certainly make sure that happens. And I'm saying that now because I think it's important for members putting their comments forward on the release but comments bit, because I do think we do need to discuss that at combined authority, Chair.
Thank you very much. Right, so fine. In that case,
Can I just qualify procedure?
yeah.
We didn't have option 1A written down in terms of the option 1 that we agreed on. What we're actually looking at now is a resolution here for an addendum to be considered as option 1A.
Yes.
That resolution is
Yes.
so time.
Yes.
We're now looking for an addendum under 1A.
Yeah.
Separate.
Do you want to just?
It is a matter for this committee. Option 1A hasn't previously been referred to. There are a number of ways that you can, there's a couple of ways that you can do this, committee members. You can either request assurance that the minutes of this meeting is put forward to the combined authority as per Councillor Lewis's suggestion, or you can take the more formal route of making an amendment in meeting to this procedure and adding that 1A. The matter is for you as committee members.
I think the first part of it through your chair is an obvious route, having agreed option 1. I think option 1A is actually then going forward as an option that we haven't discussed in terms of the issues from today's meeting. I think that's something that's got to be clarified in terms of any significant information that's been given here today from the officers today on moving forward. And I think there's a time that we ought to have time. Perhaps there's no rush on this for us. We've had a rush for clearance. There's no rush on this for us. And I think that should be first item on the next meeting. That we look at what option A should be in clarity of the further information that we got today. So we're all clear on what that further information was today.
Right. Just, are we meeting before or after the next combined authority meeting?
The day after.
You can do it outside of the
So you're happy for us to do it outside the meeting rather than formally? That's good. That's good. That's fine. I just, what was worrying me about, we're all meant to, because we're meant to all be in person when you make decisions nowadays. I accept the government are looking to potentially alter that, but right. So we will go down that second route. Okay. So that's fine. In terms of the work plan, anybody get any comments on that? No. So the next meeting is on the 19th of September. Sorry, Councillor Craig, yes.
Just say on the back of the agenda all the dates that are there for coming forward relate to 2024, 25.
Yeah.
So that they're all wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if they can
No,
be.
they're wrong,
Yeah.
So it's not just.
I was looking at it and I thought,
So it's not just
we've
the combined
got all
authority
out
to make mistakes,
elections
it's
on the
Scrutiny to make
1st of
mistakes
May,
as well.
so we won't be anybody here on the 2nd. Okay, thank you.
That's already been picked up. So thank you all very much for your
Thank
time
you.
and thank you for your contributions. Thank you.